Okay, I'm going to jump in and we'll continue to admit people as they come, but welcome back, everyone. We are so grateful to have you join us. On short notice, we added this learning session. The topic seemed prescient and something that many of us have been talking about between ourselves and in larger groups. And so Rabbi Kulik and I felt it would be valuable to bring an expert in on the topic. And so I want to welcome David Siegel to our Zoom space, to virtual Nashville. David is the president of an organization called Friends of Elnet. The best way, and I know he'll talk more about it, that I can describe, or that I often describe Elnet, is sort of a European version of APAC, if you will, an organization that works with European leaders with regards to education and support around for Israel. And David is a former Israeli diplomat. He's been involved in foreign policy formulation at the highest levels, including Consul General to the Southwest United States. He served as Chief of Staff to Israel's Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Director of Foreign Ministry's International Organizations Department, and Chief of Staff to 3 of Israel's ambassadors to the United States. He holds an MA in International Relations from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy and a BA in Political Science from the University of Vermont. You don't have to remember any of that, but just by way of introduction. And David, I want to just jump into this conversation today by sharing a little piece that I read in one of the many sort of articles and pieces I've been reading, we've all been reading over the last 10 days. And this is what it said. It said, the Russian bombardment of the Kyiv television tower, which is located near the Babi Yar Memorial, was reported to have hit a part of the ravine inadvertently. The television tower stands right above the killing fields, overlooking the location of the memorial. There was no attack on the memorial complex itself, but the symbolism was hard to ignore. Zelensky called on world Jewry to, quote, wake up to the threats posed by Russia's invasion, adding that, quote, Nazism is always born in silence. A translation of his speech into Hebrew was soon uploaded to the presidential Facebook page. The statement had as much to do with geopolitics as it did with his personal identity. Ukrainians have become frustrated over the past week with what they see as Israeli diplomatic equivocation, regardless of the evident needs of Israeli security, which must take into account the Russian military presence in Syria. Zelensky had never seemed to me, including the one time that I discussed the issue with him over dinner, this is the author, not me, to be particularly comfortable with deploying or inhabiting his Jewish background in public. Despite the fact that Ukrainians enjoy pointing out his national success as an indication of a lack of anti-Semitism in the country, and the fact that his Jewishness was not a liability during the 2019 presidential campaign, it felt to me, this is the author, like his uncertainty about his identity would prove an awkward and evident tension. But now here he is, effortlessly deploying it for the greater good of the state. Zelensky is doubling down on his Jewish heritage at the same time that he represents a sort of postmodern version of Pinocchio, stepping out of the television set and into the real world where he has become a real boy. So, can we talk about Israel?
Yes. Well, first of all, Rabbi, that's a very powerful quote and a very challenging way to start a very complex issue. So I thank you for that. I want to thank both rabbis and both communities. I am the son of a conservative rabbi. I am a member of the advisory board of HUC Israel. So I feel very, very close to both movements, and it's a great honor to be with you. But let's jump right in and talk about the situation. So, first of all, I think we're at a very unique Jewish moment. This goes way beyond Israel, and this issue is not really about Israel. Obviously, it's about Ukraine, Russia, the world order, future of Europe, and on and on. But we are in a very complex situation in the sense that for the first time, we have an international hero, more and more compared to Churchill, who is not only Jewish, but is a self-identified Jew and from a family of Holocaust survivors. who presents himself as a Jew, and he's not Israeli. And this is quite in a way, an interesting moment, and even a challenge to, the myths of Zionism, the heroism of what it means to be a modern Jew. I mean, here he was getting on television in one of his public addresses, and he spoke about Easter and Lent, at the same time as being identified as a Jewish leader and the connection to Israel, which is very substantial. But Israel here is in a very painful and in a very complex place. And let me just first say that I don't represent the Israeli government anymore. I used to for a good 30 years of my career. I now work for a non-governmental organization, so I will speak about Israel, but I don't represent the government. And I think it would be very easy for all of us to say, and certainly for me to say, that I wish that Israel was in a position that it could not only, voice a very strong moral, a very clear moral position on this horrendous aggression that is going to get a lot worse, unfortunately, because the Russian strategy is to terrorize civilians in order to break down the opponent, and this is what we're seeing. You're not seeing attacking hospitals, orphanages, and mental institutions as a mistake. You're seeing that as part of a strategy that is going to get worse and worse. So it is a horrendous, horrendous moment, and it's a turning point in history. And I wish more than anything, like I think all of us, that Israel would be in a situation that it could not only be morally clear, but could lead the world in moral clarity, because that's part of the calling of a Jewish state. But, there's also a situation of reality that makes Israel's position very, very complicated. And it needs to tread very carefully in this minefield. This is not just about interest versus values. This is really about existential interest versus values, because when we say that Russia is on Israel's next door, this is more complicated than Poland's situation right now. It's more dangerous than NATO's situation right now, because the Israeli Air Force operates over Syria and under Russian noses almost every day of the week, because Israel is in an ongoing war, and we call it a war between the wars, but this is a new kind of warfare, but it's been going on for 6 or 7 years now, with the Israeli Air Force conducting hundreds, if not thousands, of sorties over the skies of Syria in careful coordination with the Russian military presence there that can shut down Israel in a moment. If they wanted to, they can turn on those radars that are the best in the world, and no aircraft would take off from Ben Gurion, let alone fly over Syria. And the reason we need to do that is because Iran, and this is the irony of the Iran nuclear negotiations that are coming to a head or not, we'll see, in convergence with this whole global crisis. Here is Israel trying to stop Iran from transferring precision-guided missiles by the thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands to circle Israel from all sides. And this is something that Israel will absolutely have to continue doing. Now, if Israel was in a situation where it openly and aggressively criticized Syria, Russia, and provided military means to Ukraine, like other Western countries, Israel would be face-to-face and maybe a trigger point with Russia. And the question that Israelis ask is, if that was the case, who would guarantee stopping those weapons from being transferred to Hezbollah and so on, if not for the Israeli Air Force? No one would declare a no-fly zone over Syria, instead of Israel. So,
David, you just went mute, just so you know. There you go. We
I don't
last
know how that happened. That was the first in 2 years. It sort of muted itself. Maybe someone didn't like what I said. So Israel really is in a complex strategic situation. I think we shouldn't make light of it. It is very serious. It's much more than just having, Russia as a next door neighbor. The stakes for Israel are as high as or higher than any country dealing with Russia right now. So
David,
what Israel did.
Can we just go back for one moment?
Sure.
Because if I need clarification, maybe others do too.
Absolutely.
Can we just back up to speak to Russia's role vis-a-vis Syria? If for people that may not know.
Absolutely. So look, this goes back to roughly 2014. You remember, there was a red line that the U.S. put on Syria's use of chemical weapons, and then, whatever the history is, and we won't get into it now, but Russia became very involved in taking out supposedly the chemical armaments from Syria, and then the Russians came in and became part of the civil war in Syria, helped the Assad regime basically reestablish its control over this horrendous civil war that was going on. It's been going on for over 10 years now. So Russia today controls the skies over Syria. And not only does it control the skies over Syria that are critical because Iran is transferring all this weaponry to Hezbollah in Lebanon and in Syria. And to date, they have around 150,000 rockets and missiles just in those two areas, Syria and Lebanon, including storage depots, and they are upgrading those missiles to make them GPS guided so that they can hit with precision strikes everything in Israel. So this has been the big effort over the last decade to try to stop that, to try to slow it down. And Israel works, ironically, with the Russians that are positioned in Syria, and even tells the Russians before we attack that Israel is about to conduct an operation. So imagine, the Kiryat in Tel Aviv, which is the IDF military headquarters, and underground is the national bunker where the entire military leadership sits. And there's a Russian officer who mans a red line, an emergency line, and speaks in Russian every day to his Russian counterparts in Latakia in Syria, which is the northern port where the Russian military headquarters is, and basically coordinates the Israeli aerial activity over Syria. Now, one more point that is important to remember is that Russia has the most advanced anti-aircraft radars and missiles in the world, including the United States. And the Russians have positioned those systems inside Syria. And over the years, Israel press, United States press to make sure that those systems remain controlled by Russia and not by the Iranians or the Syrians. The Russians can very easily turn those radars on against the Israeli aircraft. Israel would have to take out those systems, which are the most advanced in the world, and it could, and we would be in a direct shooting war with the Russians. So it's right around the corner. And this is one of the strategic reasons why, and again, I am frustrated, and I'm sure everyone on this call is frustrated, that Israel can't be more direct and more forceful about this incredibly horrendous aggression. But that's part of the reality. The other part of the reality is that there are various estimates of the number of Jews, both in Russia and in Ukraine. And this is a modern day hostage situation as well, not just nuclear, but it's also about the Jewish communities. There are, I think, over 500,000 Jews in Russia and roughly 300,000 in Ukraine. So you have all of these sensitivities at the same time. So what Israel has done very carefully is it created or it constructed a policy that is complex, where Lapid, the foreign minister, and the next prime minister is much more forceful in condemning Russia by name. And Prime Minister Bennett, who also is involved in very interesting mediation efforts right now behind the scenes, is careful, more muted, expresses concern, support for the Ukrainian people, but has not outwardly condemned the Russians. So Israel has played a very, very careful walk through this minefield for all of these reasons. And the last thing I'll say, which is interesting, and I don't know if you saw the David Ignatius piece yesterday in the Washington Post. From my days in Washington, he was always the mouthpiece for the administration, especially the State Department. And by the way, think of the irony of Blinken coming from a Holocaust surviving family as well. I mean, the Jewish angles here are just endless. But he said yesterday that the Israeli mediation is very serious, very significant behind the scenes. And the world one day may thank Israel for being the one that was able to work with both sides. So, you have all of this, and I'm sure there's more, but, just to move on to the next question, it's complicated, it's anguishing. Israel can certainly do much more in terms of bringing in not just Jewish, but non-Jewish refugees to Israel, and that's an ongoing debate. to the extent, and I'll just end with this, that Zelensky wants to speak to the Knesset, and there's been all this he and hum and about how to do that on Zoom or more official. And here it is that the municipality of Tel Aviv just announced that they're going to open Rabin Square and have him speak to the Israeli public directly, over the skies of Tel Aviv. And that may be what ends up happening. So it's very multidimensional and complex and very painful.
So thank you. I want to follow up on what you just said to kind of narrow it to the refugee challenge that was created with the situation in Ukraine right now. And Israel had also a bit of a back and forth regarding what to do with refugees. Do we let only Jewish refugees? Do we allow any refugees? And even the question that I was reading about of whether Israel should pursue this crisis in Ukraine as an opportunity to create a gateway for a mass aliyah of Ukrainian Jews to Israel, or if here, because of what's going on and because the Jews in Ukraine are very, very proud of their identity, is Israel doing a service to the country by taking some of these Ukrainians from Ukraine in order to grow the citizens of Israel? Do you see? So it's like the refugee has two parts. One is what Israel is doing or not doing with refugees who are not Jewish. And the other one is, should Israel, or is it smart or wise for Israel to use this moment to bring some of those Ukrainian Jews to the country, or this is the time to say, no, it's not fair, it's not morally right to take these Ukrainians out of Ukraine when they are fighting for the freedom of not only themselves, but all of the country?
That's a great question, Rabbi. And again, this is a very painful issue for us to contemplate. And the good news, I guess, is that the debate is very, very intense, and it involves civil society in Israel and involves different aspects of the government. And remember that this government, first of all, maybe we'll start with that. This government is almost 1 year old now. In June, it will be a year. No one believed that a coalition with an Arab Islamist party, left-wing Meretz, Labor, and right-wing parties would coexist for that long, and here it is. It's a reality. And the prime minister that only has 6 seats out of the majority of over 60 that he needs is really leading a tiny fraction inside this coalition and is able to keep all this together. So we need to realize also that the Israeli government is I would say it's probably less than the whole. The parts more important than the whole, and the parts have different strategies and policies. And the Minister of Interior is much harder line when it comes to refugee issues, but she's under intense pressure both from the public and the media and other parts of the government, like Nachman Shai, who's now the Minister of Diaspora, who's much more attuned and minded to liberal values, and he's clashing with the Minister of Interior and demanding that many more non-Jewish refugees be allowed into Israel. And I think the debate again is this really about us, or is it about more than us? And this is one of those moments in history that it's not necessarily a Jewish issue. This is a world issue. This is really about the future of Ukraine, Russia, the world order. There's a Jewish element in it, but this is exactly the heart of the debate. Should Israel be dealing with this as a Jewish issue, or dealing with this as a democracy, and not just a Jewish state, but as a democracy that is part of the community of democracies, and to take a much wider view of its role in history, our role in history, and dealing with these issues. Let me just first lay out what is really happening on the ground, because I'm not sure everyone is up to date on all the nuances. So first of all, Israel is very committed to the humanitarian work vis-a-vis Ukraine. we have, I haven't counted, but at least dozens of diplomats now in the line of danger on the borders of Ukraine, all across Eastern Europe. Many of them focused, ironically, in Poland right now, where we didn't have an embassy at all for, well, we had an embassy, but no ambassador for a year and a half. And now there are two embassies there because the Israeli embassy in Ukraine is now hosted in Poland. And you have diplomats on the border and humanitarian workers, both government and Jewish agency and private. And there's now, efforts to set up an Israeli field hospital to treat refugees and their families. And there are Israelis inside Ukraine, with all these NGOs running around, providing humanitarian support. There were 3 Israeli military aircraft that landed in that region and brought 100 tons of humanitarian supplies. And hopefully there'll be much more coming, including 6 mega generators to help the hospital in Lvov operate without electricity. This is a massive undertaking, and there's going to be much, much more. And unfortunately, it's going to be needed. So you have that side of the humanitarian work on the ground. Roughly 10,000 Israelis were taken out of Ukraine. There's still 1,500 Israelis, not Ukrainian Jews, but Israeli nationals that are stuck. And I know some of them that are stuck inside some of the cities that are encircled, and they cannot get out because it's encircled by the Russian military right now as we speak. So you have that aspect. In Israel, the big debate is about the morality of who should be allowed in, under what parameters. Is it temporary? Do you let them in at all? Do you find a way to extend it? And as I said, there's going to be different points of view, and there's going to be an intense debate. And unfortunately, as things get worse and worse, that debate is going to be more and more intense, and it will be staring all of us in the face because the civilian situation is absolutely horrendous. At the same time, Israel needs to prepare for something much different. And that may be a massive wave of aliyah that we have not seen since the early 1990s or late 80s, where the expectation of hundreds of thousands of Jews, both from Ukraine and from a newly isolated Russia and Iron Curtain Russia, will seek to leave. And Israel is now preparing for that. And that means, coming out with bids to take over hotels and to take over hostels. And these are going to be the buildings that will house Jewish refugees that come in. So all of this is in the air, but I think the bottom line is that Israel has to find a way to lead in moral issues and to bring in refugees, both Jewish and non-Jewish. And this is not just about per capita, cold calculations that economists do, but to lead the way. And that's very difficult to do. Israel's already stretched to the limits in terms of its own diversity, as we know. And the prospect of additional tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of non-Jewish Ukrainian nationals coming into Israel permanently is going to be complicated. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's going to be subject to public debate. But I think Israelis, and you look at the polling, are very, very minded to this, just like the American Jews and the American public at large. The percentages are very, very high that are demanding that the government do more. And unfortunately, we're only at the beginning of a long and painful process. This is only the end of week 2 of this war, and this is unfortunately, it's probably going to continue for quite a while.
David, and this is a little off topics on specifics around Israel, but one of the conversations we were having yesterday around, and it kind of dovetailed off of Thomas Friedman's article last week on here's the 3 ways this war ends. And the third option he gave, which was sort of the dream option, the best option, if there's a good option, was the idea that that Russians themselves were to rise up and turn against Putin, including his closest circle, the oligarchs and the Russian people, and that would be sort of the best way out. And I'm just curious from your perspective of what you're seeing, how realistic is that scenario?
I don't know if you saw the report about the Russians bringing in 16,000 jihadists from the Middle East to now fight on their side in Ukraine. It's almost unbelievable, but this is happening at the same time. And you can only assume that, some of these fighters coming in are not going to be, human rights observers. So I think the sense is that things are going to get much, much worse. It would be great if there was some way to end this, internally in Russia. You hear a lot of American commentators talk about how Putin, isolated himself, and one of the reasons he was so worried about COVID was to end up in a hospital and then to have someone take him out because he's so damaging to the circle around him that has enriched itself on his rule and now is deeply upset. And we know that the Russian strategy has backfired. And we know that the idea evidently was to have a light, quick policing action to go in, to decapitate the leadership without that much bloodshed, and it would be over in a week. This is the way they saw it. But it backfired, and now they're bogged down, and now they're employing more and more brutal methods with, soldiers that didn't want to be there, that were unprepared, and on and on. So, we're all reading that together. So there's nothing really new that I could tell you. We in Elnet, we typically have military experts from Israel join our network because I'll talk about what we do in a few moments. But when we work with Europe, it's very important to bring a senior national security point of view. So we had Mike Herzog, who's now Israel's ambassador in Washington and is doing a great job there. He was our advisor. And now we have General Yadlin, Amos Yadlin, who was the head of INSS in Tel Aviv, most important think tank in Israel, and who was the head of IDF military intelligence. And by the way, he was one of the pilots over Osirak in Iraq in the late 80s when Israel took out the nuclear reactor in Iraq. And he just wrote an article today that hasn't been translated into English yet with 10 different parameters about what might happen in this conflict. And it's everything from, how the military campaign goes, how painful the sanctions will be, what reinforcements each side can bring in. Will there be a clash between Russia and NATO? Will he resort to chemical and biological weapons, if not tactical nuclear weapons? All of this is real. All of this, if you're reading carefully, you're seeing in the news today that this isn't speculation. This is intelligence showing what the Russians are doing that indicates that they're making preparations for chemical weapon use, biological use. So just to answer your question, I don't think anyone really knows how this will end up. Russian history shows that, failures ultimately led to revolution, to the Bolshevik Revolution, to leaders, ending their time. But Putin is really without precedent. This whole thing is without precedent. If Putin goes, who even replaces him? What is the process to replace him? It's unclear. So we're really at a moment that is unique in history, unfortunately.
I want to give the opportunity, Rabbi, unless you want to jump in, for others to also ask questions. I'm still a little jaw dropped on the 16,000 jihadists. If you want to know if you have new information for us, that was new for me.
I'll share. I'll send it to you after. It's in the wires right now with photos, and they're being very public about it. And some of this is a campaign of intimidation as well.
Sure.
We'll bring in the jihadists from the Middle East, and unfortunately, the civilian population is the target.
Yeah.
The strategy is to bombard civilian targets until the enemy breaks. It's just horrendous.
Friends, questions you would like to ask? Avi, jump on in.
Hi, David. Thank you so much for your insight. You sound just as torn, if not more so than all of us, between what we wish Israel could do and what it is able to do. A little concern about how the world will view Israel if it continues to stay in this kind of a neutral place. Certainly the words from the Ukraine claiming we don't wear a flag or whatever, they're not helpful. It's not, but it's also unsettling to think that Bennett asked the Ukraine to tone down its language or to even give up to the Russians. And it just, obviously it just doesn't feel good. And yet we know Israel can't risk its own population to do the wrong thing. Any concern about world opinion is what my question is.
Yeah, thank you, Avi. It's a very, very smart question. And there's news coming out now of more complaints on the Ukrainian side that Bennett offered this or told Zelensky to do that. It's very hard to tell if these stories are true or not. You know, the Ukrainians were complaining about El Al the other day, and then took a step back once they realized that the complaints were simply baseless. So, you know, there's going to be a lot of back and forth, and some of it is intentional, some of it is accidental. You know, obviously Ukraine has to stand up for Ukraine, and the Israelis have to make their own calculations. And there's, you know, there's a tremendous amount of urgency, and some of it, you know, you could argue is unfair in the way it's coming out against Israel. And you know, I would recommend, you know, one of the things that I do, you know, it's one thing to read the wires in the newspapers and the blogs. It's another thing to deal with moral issues. And for moral issues, I think like many of us, and certainly our rabbis, I go to the Hartman folks. I listen to their discussions. They had two wonderful podcasts between Yossi Klein Halevi and Rabbi Daniel Hartman this week and last week. They do it weekly. And I would urge all of us to, you know, spend the 20 minutes. It's worth, you know, you could put it on fast speed and get the bottom line quickly. But they're really anguishing, you know, about this. And I think one of the things that we need to draw on is our Jewish values and our Jewish history. And since we have two rabbis on and serious congregants, I'll be very humble, but I'll tell you that this Shabbat is Vayikra, and Vayikra is about summoning Moses. And it's all about living a meaningful life. And the book of Vayikra, the third book, is all about sacrifices. And you can't be summoned, you can't live a life of meaning without sacrifice. And the question is, what is the right sacrifice? And, you know, in our sources is very interesting rabbinical debate. What would you do if you were a Jew in a country and you had an evil ruler that said, give me your limb in return for the life of someone else? And the rabbis debate, should you give a limb or not? But ultimately, the bottom line test is, do you bleed to death or not? I mean, is it your life versus someone else's life? And in a normal situation, you have to go with your life first. So what I would argue is that Israel could do a lot of things, but there's certain things that it can't do. And I think we need to recognize that and focus on where Israel can do more safely. But it cannot bleed itself in this situation where the world is rushing to a nuclear deal with Iran that we all know is morally wrong, strategically wrong, and really is going to be a disaster no matter what your politics are, because they're weeks away from you know, being done with this, the Iranians. And they'll, you know, does Israel really have a coalition behind it, or is it alone in this process and it needs to deal with navigating its own national security interests that are very real and very immediate? So I would say, you know, let's weigh this. Let's understand that morality is about balancing between different, and even our rabbinical tradition is all about balancing between various considerations that are very weighty. And Israel is in a place now, and it's not the only one in the world. Look, when Poland says, we're not going to send the planes, you guys do it. You know, Poland says to NATO, it's because Poland doesn't want, you know, Russian retribution against Poland. And the United States and NATO has certain lines that they don't dare cross, even though morally you look at the situation and you say, you've got that convoy, they're sitting there, all those tanks, and it could have been taken out in 5 minutes. Reminds us of our own history and, you know, all the questions about, you know, the Auschwitz and the train tracks, you know, the Havdil, as we say in Hebrew. It's maybe morally different, but these are the issues. So every country has a line that they don't cross unless the situation worsens. And you'll see as it worsens, you know, NATO may have to do more. There's talk now about, you know, the West moving into Western Ukraine and holding on to that and creating a safe area for Ukraine inside Ukraine, and then challenging the Russians. But, you know, everything here becomes nose to nose, aircraft to aircraft, nuclear power to nuclear power. And, you know, countries are going to be very careful. So I would argue it's not just Israel. And behind the scenes, Israel is doing very important things. If you put all the dots together, you'll see that Israel lobbied the UAE and Saudi Arabia to vote in favor of the condemnation of Russia and the United Nations last week, and to release more oil to the market in order to relieve pressure, and was doing this on behalf of the United States. So behind the scenes, Israel's doing all sorts of things. But to your point, and I think this is the most important point of your question, am I worried about the fallout for Israel? And I think yes, and I'll tell you why I think. This situation is going to make the world so sensitive about any use of power, whether it's right or wrong, when this is over. And here's a question that the Hartman folks pose that is, I've been thinking about this all week. What if Israel has to go in and take out the Iranian nuclear program? Will Israel be treated like Ukraine, the victim, or will Israel be treated like Russia, the aggressor? And these are the questions that we need to begin asking. It's very easy to condemn a country when there's no cost. And some people say that the BDS movement is so popular and so successful because what's really the cost that you pay for it? Maybe Ben and Jerry's is paying a little bit more than they thought right now, or Unilever. But when you attack Russia, there's a cost. So, countries hesitate. But when you attack a smaller country like Israel, it's easier. So I think for us as Jews and advocates for Israel, we have to be very, very mindful of that, in the future as a result of this.
Thank you.
Thanks, Avi. Thanks, David. Other questions? Judy.
As Jews in this country, is there anything specific or maybe general that we could or should be doing in this whole situation vis-a-vis Israel, the Ukraine, Russians, you name it? Is there something, are there any things concrete things that we could do?
That's a great question, Judy, and thank you for that. Look, I think it's very much about each individual belief and value. There are a whole host of organizations in Israel and NGOs that are on the ground in Ukraine, on the borders of Ukraine, providing assistance to refugees. So if that is something that is of concern to the community, there are wonderful organizations. I mean, there's an organization called Israel's Flying Aid, and they specialize in penetrating authoritarian governments behind the lines and using secret networks to provide humanitarian aid. And they've been operating in Syria for 10 years, Israelis on the ground, and they're doing the same in Ukraine. You have more public organizations like Israel Aid, which is a coalition of organizations, and they're dealing with trauma. I mean, we're talking to, I need to say a word or two about my organization in a few minutes, but there's going to be trauma issues in Europe for, I can't even tell you, years, maybe decades. You're talking about a nation of 43 million, 45 million, and we're not even dealing with the Russian side yet. I mean, think about the trauma of everyday citizens or a soldier who didn't even know that he or she are going to be in Ukraine. They were just kids, and no one told them that they were going to war, and they're suddenly in a combat situation. And so there's going to be trauma for millions of people. And there are Israeli organizations, unfortunately, that are the best in the world in treating trauma, including here in the United States, because trauma is not a well-known or recognized condition. You can't really see it. You can't really define it. By the time you diagnose it, it's too late. You have it in urban areas, you have it in civilian situations, you certainly have it in military situations. So I would say, pick what your passion is and where you would want to participate. And that's a wonderful and direct way to help, organizations either Jewish or Israeli that are doing this kind of work on the ground, both for Jews and for non-Jews. And we can share more information with you about that.
David, I think that Avi has another question, if others are okay. Then if you can just tell us a little bit more about Elnet's work would be great as well, please.
Thank you, Rabbi. So was there another question, or should I go into
Avi,
that?
you're muted. You're muted, Avi.
Only if no one else wants to step up, I have one more question. And actually, it's a twofold question, and they're not related. And actually, one is a concern, and that is the immigration, the bringing in of Ukrainians. because Israel has the same responsibility every country, including the United States, has to bring in Jews and non-Jews. And that's going to be a big debate in Israel. And we were already having refugee problems, as you know, we all know. And so that's the concern. But you mentioned that you alluded to Bennett and Lapid working together, good guy, bad guy. And could you give us some inside look at how the two of them may be planning how they go out in the public? Because it appears at times like they were oppositional to each other. But you're helping us understand this is coordinated.
Yeah, thank you again, Avi. Good questions. This is a good group. I have to come out and see all of you in person one of these days, I hope. I hear so much about Nashville. Look, it's funny. I'll share something with you. Bennett was a next door neighbor of mine in Haifa. And I mentioned that to some of you at the beginning that his parents were part of our conservative shul in Haifa, although they later became more Orthodox. And Lapid, you know, is a product of the Reform Shul Bet Daniel in Tel Aviv. They don't talk about it publicly that much, but boy, this is a different crop of Israeli leaders that are very minded to Jewish communities overseas and different streams of Judaism, which is a wonderful thing to see. Although very complicated, as you know, in Israel, I don't need to tell you. But Bennett and Lapid, I would argue, and all evidence that I've seen indicates that they are very, very close, and they are going to switch, and there will be a transition as they committed to each other. You know, and Lapid has been quite the gentleman in Israeli politics of sort of defraying his primacy and, you know, allowing Bennett with as I said, a tiny, you know, a 6-person political party become the prime minister, which is sort of unprecedented in Israel. And you have, you know, all this talk. Well, sure, he can mediate between Russia and Ukraine if he can mediate between all these political parties, you know, in the Israeli government, from the Arabists, the Islamists, and the Arab Party, first time in Israel's history, all the way to the serious hardcore right, which is Shaked, Saar, Lieberman, and all of them are sort of taking a step back and letting, you know, this government run fairly harmoniously. I would add a third name, which is Isaac Herzog, the new president. The new president is almost like a second foreign ministry, a second State Department. Herzog just went to Turkey. I mean, if you just think about Israel's role in the world today, and you think back 20, 30 years, we had no relations with India, no relations with China, no relations in the Arab Middle East. And you look at Israel now, just this week, Lapid was in Jordan visiting the king for the second time yesterday. The president of Israel, Herzog, went to see Erdogan in Turkey for a summit, but before that, he had to go and calm down the rest of the Mediterranean. So he went to Cyprus and he went to Greece to calm the Hellenic countries down because they're part of Israel's new alliance in the Eastern Mediterranean. And then he goes and he meets with Erdogan for the first time since 2008, when Olmert went there. That was the last high-level Israeli visit. We're in 2022. Look at how the world is changing. And at the same time, the Israel chief of staff of the IDF, Kochavi, lands in Bahrain in a military aircraft that flew over Saudi Arabia with, you know, men and women in military uniform to land in Bahrain to have defense talks, you know, with the U.S. Fifth Fleet, the Bahraini government, and this is on the back of, you know, Bennett going to the UAE and going to Bahrain, and you know, Gantz going to Morocco, and you know, on and on and on. So we're in a new world, and Israel's at the hub of all of these relationships. It's almost hard to think of countries today that don't have relationships with Israel that are not pariahs. So if Israel has a challenge, it's how to maneuver between all of this. Israel's relationship with China, when you have the United States facing, you know, the huge technological and strategic threat of China for years to come. And how does Israel work that triangle? And Israel and Russia, we've already touched on today. This has been an open secret for years, but now it's front and center. How does Israel maneuver that? And now you have, and this is the reason for my organization, now you have the Europeans coming back as a fourth power. So look at the world. There's no real global cop anymore. This is not about a unilateral American sort of Pax Americana anymore. So you have China, you have Russia, you have the EU waking up, the German government making statements that are historic in the last week, saying they'll double their defense spending. They'll meet the NATO required minimums that they never met in 70 years, no matter who the US president was. It took one president called Putin to turn everything around. You know, who was it, Lenin, that said that, you know, there are decades where nothing happens and there are weeks where decades happen. So we're in a week where decades happen. So all of this is taking place when Israel has a government that is the strangest government we've ever had, where all these elements are sticking together. And I think the core of it is Lapid and Bennett and their strategic relationship. And I'd say it's pretty solid. And having a president like Herzog, who is well known and beloved in the world, ironically, his brother is the ambassador in Washington. This is sort of a network of leaders that are sticking together and are doing good for Israel, even in this impossible situation.
We're going to take one more question. Oh, go ahead, David.
No, go ahead, Nanette.
Nanette, go ahead.
It's not so much a question as much as telling you, David, this has been so enlightening. I want to thank you so much for your expertise. I'm just honored to be listening to you, and it's just been fabulous. That's just what I want to say.
Well, that's very sweet. Thank you very much. So maybe I'll use this opportunity to say a few words about what we do. So Rabbi Rice said something, you know, very accurate, that we're sort of like the AIPAC in Europe. You know, we were created around 15 years ago by a group of Jewish leaders that actually came out of AIPAC, and there was a debate in AIPAC about whether to take the model overseas or not. And Larry Hochberg is our chairman and our co-founder. And he's also, of course, in Rabbi Rice's family. So we all feel very, very close. And this is why we have this opportunity to share this together. And 15 years ago, the idea was to set up a pro-Israel network in Europe. And back then, Europe was sort of like a sideshow. I mean, you had friendly American presidents, you had, you know, everything was very stable, and the US-Israel relationship was, you know, the most important, and it still is. But the world is changing. And the whole Ukraine crisis, I think, is putting it in very, very sharp relief about how much the world has changed. The United States, although today or yesterday, I guess, approved, you know, a very important package for Israel, which includes $1 billion in the Iron Dome funding, but further, you know, other macro and micro packages that altogether are almost $5 billion, critical for Israel's security. But I would say the following: America is going to be focused internally on infrastructure, on society, on domestic needs for many, many years to come. You don't need me to tell you that. America is involved in a contest with China that is just beginning. The book written by Admiral Stavridis that I recommend that everybody at least look at, if not read, is called 2034. World War III with China. He was the head of NATO, very serious guy, the dean of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy in Boston, writes a book about the war between America and China. It's called 2034, not 2024. 2034, because it will take China a decade to really threaten America, and they're in that direction. So what it means to me is that America will be pulled between Russia and the challenges of the future of Europe and authoritarianism there, and the Chinese rise and Taiwan and semiconductors and the future of technology and all of that for many, many years to come. How much will America really be in the Middle East? So sure, America will provide Israel with strategic support from afar and Iron Dome and all of that. But Israel is expected to step up now, and really has been stepping up for years quietly. So behind the scenes, now you know about the Abraham Accords, which was another really historic turning point last year. And you have all these countries with Saudi Arabia quietly behind them. It's not going to be public because it's very conservative and it wants other things from the United States and the West, but there are going to be more and more countries in the Middle East that are working with Israel. And as the globe becomes warmer and warmer, and food and water and all of these things that Israel specializes in and is a world leader on becomes more important to most of humanity, Israel is going to become, I believe, a tremendous hub, but it's expected to step up and build coalitions for itself to stabilize the Middle East. And this is where ELNET comes in. ELNET is the European Leadership Network, and our goal is to build relations between Israel and Europe. Why Europe? Because it's 36 countries. Most of them are liberal democracies. When I say 36, it doesn't include Ukraine. It may be more in the future, we'll see. But just the typical Europe that you know, beyond the European Union, which is just 27, and I include the UK in that, which is now post-Brexit and it's sort of alone out there. And it looks at Israel as a major partner. So Israel has an opportunity now to build relationships with liberal democracies that are economically powerful. They're Israel's largest trade partner in the world, twice as large as the United States. 1/3 of Israel's exports go to Europe and 1/2 of Israel's imports come from Europe to Israel. So Israel's totally dependent on Europe, and people don't realize this. So sure, Germany is a strategic ally and it provides Israel with strategic submarines and battleships and all of this, but it goes well beyond that. Most of Israel's research and innovation, most of what we know about Israel as a startup nation comes from American investors, but European partners and European state funding for all of these institutions. So to safeguard that, you got to have a relationship with them. And to have a relationship with them means setting up offices, setting up boards with European leaders that are well-versed in European politics, and they're participants, just like AIPAC is a participant in politics here in America. And some of them contribute to campaigns and they work with politicians. And we bring those delegations to Israel. We have brought thousands of officials from Europe to Israel. And there's so much to do because 36 countries and parliaments come and they go, and you have elections and you have new people that don't know anything. Like the German government, they're all new. They were socialists, liberals, and the Green Party. They were pacifists. And now they realize that they're a frontline country, and they're looking to Israel for inspiration on national security, on cybersecurity, on military platforms, on command and control platforms. How do you do this as a national security in this new national security era that we're in? So when you look at all of this now compared to 15 years ago, I say to myself as a former Israeli diplomat, wow, that they had this vision, because there was no pro-Israel network in Europe. You can't function that way without bringing delegations of government leaders to Israel, members of parliament to Israel, the think tanks, the journalists, the elites, the people that think and that contribute to public discourse. Bring them to Israel. This is the only way to do it. So we've been doing this for years. This year we have 25 delegations and 10 strategic dialogues, and more, we're doing it with the entire Middle East. So in our discussions now with Europe, we bring Egypt and we bring Jordan, we bring the UAE, we bring the Saudis, we bring Bahrain, we bring Morocco, we bring military, we bring civilians. We're going to meet in Abu Dhabi in person in May with Americans, Europeans, Arabs, and Israeli leaders to discuss Iran, discuss Hezbollah, discuss global warming, discuss Russia, discuss China. It's the only way to do it. So I deeply believe in this. And what I would just say to you, if you're interested, it's very easy to join us. You just send us an email. We promise not to bother you, but what you will get from us is invitations to weekly Zooms, weekly experts. This Monday at 12 o'clock Eastern, so it's 11 o'clock your time, we're featuring one of Israel's foremost experts on Russia. So if you want to know more about what Israel's doing and all these dilemmas with Ukraine and Russia, come into these discussions with us. It's an open invitation. And maybe, Rabbi, we can just get a list of who wants to be involved, to be educated. We'll be more than happy to just put you on our list so you can be part of what we're doing.
Yeah, and you can reach out either to Rabbi Kulik or to myself. I also put the email or the web address for ELNET in the chat, and I think it's pretty easy to sign up through the website as well. And I get the weekly emails, and there are really some incredible speakers. And often I think Mondays are the day in which there's a Zoom briefing. Is that correct, David?
Yeah, every Monday at 12 East Coast time. Yes.
We had a professor in Israel by the name of Paul Lips. And we would say every week that we would go to Paul's class in order to find out if we were going to make it another week. This was sort of after the second Intifada, and we would get our briefing from Professor Lips. And I feel like we're going to need to meet with you weekly, David, for our briefing here in Nashville. This has been tremendous. I'll echo Nanette's
Thank
words.
you. Thank you.
I think many of us.
Anytime, really. Anytime, rabbis, that you want to call on us, I'll be more than happy to do this. Friday is a quieter day, so Israel's already in Shabbat. So I'm more than happy to do this. Whenever there's a need, we can do this again.
Well, God willing, there won't be a need to have an updated briefing, but I have a feeling there will be. So I imagine we might call on you again. And we just wish you the best. Again, folks, the web address for Elnet is in the chat, but you can also just drop Rabbi Kulik or myself a direct email and say you want to make sure you're connected and on their list, and we'll make sure that happens. I think more than ever, we'll need Shabbat, all of us, a little respite from the craziness in the world. So we hope to see you in Shul, either West End or Micah, or wherever it is that you like to find your peace and serenity on Shabbat. And David, we all wish you a very peaceful and restful. We hope you take it Shabbat Shalom as well.
Thank you. Shabbat Shalom to everyone.
Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Executive
Thank you
Director
so much. It was
Carol
wonderful.
Moscow.